I've always said it's either something or it's nothing. If it's embraced as an institutional asset, if it's legitimized as an asset, then it's not going to zero. And if it's not going to zero, it's going to a million. And I think the short answer to your question is education. And with education comes adoption.
Michael Saylor emphasizes that Bitcoin's superior performance compared to the S&P makes it an irresistible choice for investors, offering dynamic growth and unmatched potential. Bitcoin is heading to $1 million per coin, says Michael Saylor. For Saylor, Bitcoin's trajectory is clear. It's everything or nothing, and zero is no longer an option. With growing institutional adoption and recognition of its value, Bitcoin's potential only increases. Education drives this shift, highlighting Bitcoin's decentralization, scarcity, and role as a hedge against economic uncertainty. Stay tuned for more insights.
At this point, you just have 95% of the world that still doesn't quite understand what it is. And that means, I mean, the way Bitcoin marches from 100,000 to 13 million, and by that's for your listeners, you're referring to my long-term forecast. I gave that forecast in Nashville in July of this year, and it's based upon the Bitcoin 24 model. So the Bitcoin 24 model is an open source macro model of Bitcoin adoption and macroeconomic development over the next 21 years. Anybody can go to Google and they can Google Bitcoin 24. They'll find it on GitHub. You can download that model. You can plug in all your own assumptions and you can check what we thought. But my forecast is Bitcoin, in essence, it's growing 60% a year for quite a while now. And I'm forecasting it will decelerate to 20% a year over 21 years. But that means on average, it grows about 29% a year, ARR. And that 29% a year for 21 years gets you to 13 million a coin. And so what do I expect to happen? Well, I expect lots of high net worth individuals that previously thought it's too risky or it's too scary. They see it legitimized by BlackRock. Now, BlackRock is giving guidance that you could have 2% of your portfolio in Bitcoin. And they're seeing the ETFs like IBIT. And they're noticing that these are the most successful ETFs in the history of the world. And BlackRock has got the most successful ETF ever launched. And now they're seeing the world's largest money manager, BlackRock, with more than $11 trillion of money managed. They're seeing them publish scholarly, thoughtful, responsible white papers on portfolio allocation. And instead of the 60-40 model with 60% equity and 40% bonds, now you've got 2% that they're saying you might want to put into a crypto asset like Bitcoin. So I think that you've got that group of people that are finding it. I also think you've got institutional investors that are moving into Bitcoin more frequently now. A lot of them are big investors in MicroStrategy. A lot of them trade MicroStrategy options. MicroStrategy has been the most successful stock in the S&P index. We're not in the S&P, but we're more successful than all 500 S&P companies for the past 4 years. I think this year too. So we're getting the attention of mainstream investors. And that's bringing a set of new investors to the asset class because when they buy our stock, we buy Bitcoin with it. I think the third driver is a bunch of Bitcoin standard companies. A lot of companies are recapitalizing their balance sheets on Bitcoin. MicroStrategy was the first, but Mara has done it, M-A-R-A, and Riot just announced they're doing it, R-I-O-T. And the most successful company in the Japanese stock market this year is Metaplanet, and they just did it. And Similar Scientific just did it, and they tripled their stock in very short order. So you've got like a half dozen companies that are recapitalizing to the Bitcoin standard, but you've got 60 companies that have Bitcoin. And there's a lot of companies that are getting more heavily involved. I think recently Hut 8 announced, Hut, H-U-T, and then Rumble, RUM. And so a bunch of public companies that are kind of, they're innovators, and they've got a fairly open mind, and they're flexible. And the really important thing about that, Tom, is when a public company adopts Bitcoin, they start sweeping their cash flows into it. But then after that, they may start issuing equity. And then after that, they can borrow money. So Riot just this week issued a $500 million convertible bond, and then they bought Bitcoin with it.
For the 7th week in a row, Michael Saylor has shared the Saylor Bitcoin tracker, sparking excitement among Bitcoin enthusiasts. Known for signaling MicroStrategy's next big BTC purchase, these updates highlight the company's bullish stance and growing institutional confidence in Bitcoin's long-term potential. Now let's hear more from Michael Saylor.
And so Mara did the same thing. They did a $1 billion convertible bond deal, and they bought Bitcoin. And then they did another $850 million bond deal 2 weeks later. And MicroStrategy, when we announced we were going to pursue a Bitcoin treasury company model, we announced that October 30th of just this year. And we've raised, something in the range of $15 billion in the last 6 weeks. And so you're talking about large sums of money that are flowing. I mean, much larger sums. It took us 30 years to accumulate $500 million in order to buy Bitcoin in 2020. It took us 4 years to accumulate $10 billion. And we bought Bitcoin over the next 4 years. But then it took us like 4 weeks or 5 weeks to accumulate the next 15 billion. So you would check off that box, which is company adoption. Then after that, you've got like institutional adoption, the endowments and the pension funds. There's now pension funds that are starting to allocate to Bitcoin, and there'll be big university endowments and 501c3s and insurance companies. And so that's another driver. And then you've got nation states. And of course, the news of the week is the United States Strategic Bitcoin Reserve. And the US already has about 1% of the Bitcoin. If they don't sell it, that's a big deal. And Donald Trump said, never sell your Bitcoin. And then he was elected president. But now you have Senator Cynthia Lummis advocating for a US Strategic Bitcoin Reserve. You have a very supportive cabinet, lots of cabinet members that have been pro-Bitcoin. And then Senator Lummis just posted a tweet just a few hours ago, having met with the incoming Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent, saying that she looks forward to working with him on this. And presumably that means that he is also supportive. And we know that the Trump White House and Trump is supportive. He was asked on the New York Stock Exchange floor, I think yesterday, by Jim Cramer about it. Will you do something like this? And he said, I think so. I think we need to lead. So I think that that's also positive. So let's just say there's a lot of different entities in the world with capital. I mean, who doesn't want to keep their money? Who doesn't want more money? Right? Everybody wants to either keep their money or they could use more money. And so Bitcoin is digital money. It's the greatest digital monetary network in the world, but maybe it's the first example of what I call digital capital. It's money, just so I can help people not be confused. Money is a generic term, but it decomposes in the modern world into two elements, currency and capital. Currency is the dollar and the peso and the euro. That is the medium of exchange asset. It is designated legal tender. That means you can swap it without paying a tax bill on it. And it means it's liquid and fungible, and probably it's good for paying taxes, and everybody prices things in it. That's not going to change. The world reserve currency is the dollar. The dollar's been the world reserve currency since just after World War I, and in different forms. The dollar is getting stronger, not weaker. But there's another aspect of money. It's store of value. if I had a liquid fungible asset that was a store of value that I could give to my children's children. Well, nobody thinks that's the dollar, and nobody in the US thinks it's the dollar. Rich people in the US don't have 50% of their assets invested in dollar bills. And what they do think it is in the modern world is they think it's the S&P index, like the Vanguard 500 or SPY or some index fund. Or maybe they think it's real estate. And real estate's a store of value, but it's not liquid and fungible. So it's a little bit different. It's difficult to swap it out in units of $1 million every day. And so it's not quite money, but it is capital in that regard. And gold for 5,000 years was kind of capital. It was a bar of gold bullion was that long-term store of value asset that people use. Bitcoin is emerging as digital capital. And people, they're not going to use it as a medium exchange to buy a cup of coffee. But if you want to buy something to give to your granddaughter that she can't mess up, even though she's 3 years old, and you don't want to worry about it every day, and you don't want to trade it, and you don't want to worry about antitrust and whether or not there'll be rent control on the building or renting it out, you just buy her one Bitcoin and you put it in cold storage, and then 60 years from now, she'll be rich because the one Bitcoin will probably be worth 50 million or $100 million, right? And so that what's going on right now is the emergence of Bitcoin as a digital capital network for the world. And the thing driving it from 100,000 to 13 million over the next 21 years is the adoption of it as a capital asset by people that have the wealth, have the capital. By the way, the currency collapsed in Venezuela. It collapsed in Argentina. It collapsed in Brazil. It collapsed in Cuba. It collapsed in Russia. It collapsed in every single country in Africa. You see? And so foreigners actually get it a bit better, right? It's like the bank's going to take your money. The currency's going to zero. The government's going to promise you it'll be okay and tell you to put your money in the bank. Then they're going to inflate the currency, freeze your bank account, crash the currency, and then tell you it's worthless. That's what happened in Cyprus not too long ago, if you want to go and Google that. And so the real promise of Bitcoin is very simple. It's a bank in cyberspace that won't steal your money. And it's an asset that you can store your life savings in that nobody can debase or corrupt. And those are two powerful promises for the first time in the history of the human race. No one ever gave you those two promises ever before now.
Bitcoin is transforming into the cornerstone of a global digital capital network, embraced by companies, institutions, and governments as a generational store of value. Michael Saylor highlights Bitcoin's unique design to preserve and grow wealth over decades, potentially making a single Bitcoin worth tens of millions in the future.